Hi everyone, welcome to this book discussion on Meet the Savarnas, Indian Millennials whose mediocrity broke everything with Ravikant Kisana. Very quickly introducing the speaker, Ravikant Kisana is currently the Associate Dean and Associate Professor at Wilson University, Hyderabad. His expertise lies in cultural studies and ethnographic research grounded in critical caste studies. And he also podcasts and performs live under the moniker of Buffalo Intellectual and is the author of the book Meet the Savarnas. So thank you so much for making time and doing this interview. Let me begin by asking you about the context in which you write this book. I mean, if you could talk a little bit about it.
Can you explain to me, like, what do you mean by context? I didn't understand.
Basically, the social political context, or something about maybe the academic gap context,
So,
research gap. Yeah.
um, the research gap I can talk about a little bit in terms of where this book comes from. A lot of this book comes from the idea that if you look at conventional social sciences, the lens in that we use in our academic discourse, a lot of it actually, like, I'm more interested in how that knowledge gets produced. So one of the variables for that is who's actually producing this knowledge, what are the sites of this knowledge production, who's doing the research, um, what are the lenses they're using, and a lot of this informs eventually the kind of knowledge that gets produced. And if you look at Indian academia historically in the post-colonial setup, a lot of it actually comes out from these really elite institutions. And in these elite institutions, like, I will include, like, social science departments of IITs or top central universities or even some of the better state universities. Um, because they're really elite when you compare them to the kind of degree colleges and other institutions which are cut across the country. So it's almost like some of these centers become the sites which define knowledge which gets used everywhere else, and there really isn't much of a discourse happening across the board. And that takes you to the second point: who's actually in these centers, who's actually in these central universities, who's actually inside these spaces. And in a caste stratified society, a lot of reproduction of those uh, historical modes of knowledge creation have been reproduced inside these universities. So essentially, what you're looking at is social science departments which have been in many cases created by, like, who founded the department, who were the founding, establishing. Every department has its own set of, like, oh, this so and so professor was so great, this legend. And if you start going down that road, you start realizing it's actually a very savarna ecosystem. And the opposite of that is not there. For instance, many of these savarna academics have been writing on caste, have been writing on scheduled castes, have been writing on tribals, have been writing on all kinds of people, to the point where their perspective on caste becomes a normative perspective. So if you want to understand this, something about caste, you read their books and their perspective. Whereas we don't actually get a caste commentary on their caste communities. So that is essentially, I found a big knowledge gap. For instance, if I want to connect the current political formation and, like, the current industrial complex that is there, led by Adani, Ambani, and Bansals and Jains and all of that, there is really not much of a caste commentary on Banya capital cultures, for instance. Right? So matlab hai nahi, like, there's hardly any work which is there, much less foundational work which is there. So this book comes from that kind of a space. It was an attempt to start that kind of an academic conversation, that caste is not just coming from the perspective of the marginalized, it is also a formation of elites. So if you're constantly studying the marginalization, you're forgetting to overlook that in any system where there is acute marginalization and oppression, it is directly proportional to the privilege accrued on the other side. So you're studying only half the picture. You're only looking at the marginalization. You're not looking at the privilege. So this is an attempt to study caste from a point of how privilege accrues. Who are the benefits of the system? So that's a knowledge gap which I thought one should start looking at, and hopefully this book creates a discourse or starts a discourse. Even if people are critiquing it, I'm glad that at least they're engaging with it. So there is a point of reference from which we start building, critiquing, correcting, refining discourse. So that's how I think about it.
Right, interesting, as you mentioned, and we'll come more to it, in the later part of the conversation. Let me also very quickly ask you, what are the methods and sources that you use? And the intent behind this question is actually, to also let young people who might be listening or watching to know that writing, research, etc., depends on, that kind of scientific rigor.
So that is, thank you for that question, but it's also a little bit of a loaded question because I'll tell you from the perspective of caste marginalized scholars. I work with a lot of, young first generation learners, scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, OBC scholars. The subject that they're terrified of the most at their PhD stage or in their master's stage is this subject called research methodology. It is always taught to them as like this great like enigma which you don't know. Like their professors, they'll go countless. I have a PhD student. He's a first generation learner, and he's doing his PhD under me. Like every 6 months, he keeps signing up for these UGC MOOCs of qualitative, quantitative. He keeps going for these programs. He must have done a dozens of them, but like he still doesn't feel satisfied that he knows methodology, because methodology is one of the ways in which writing style is another one. There are all these very academic points of interrogation which are actually very caste weaponized in ways to delegitimize marginalized scholars. So methodology then becomes a very interesting point of like self-reflection while creating a work like this, which is at what point does a methodology become legitimate? At what point does it like kind of become delegitimized in that sense? If you read the book, a lot of it is some kind of a reflexive autoethnography, which is also engaging with different points of discourse. Like, so my fundamental training, just to kind of give you, is in communications. Okay, so communications and culture studies, and I have a background. I've worked for a while in the communications industry, in advertising, and in advertising, one of the things that they trained you was to catch discourse or trends, because all of advertising is just like, you were selling a shampoo. What are the kids into? You catch the trend, you hook the brand onto it, and so on. So there is a little bit of trend spotting, which is fundamentally discourse. A lot of my PhD work, post PhD work, is critical discourse analysis, mixed in with a lot of autoethnographic reflections, mixed in with last 5 6 years I've worked a lot on critical race theory, and from critical race theory to try and look at critical caste studies as a point of interrogation. It's very qualitative, but like every now and then I'm also looking at like points of reference to contextualize the thing. So in that sense, it's a mix of many discursive traditions. But while writing, one of the things that I've tried very actively in the book is I wanted the book to be accessible to non-academic readers, right? And to do that, you have to constantly sort of weave a narrative story, and there's a story that you have to constantly tell. And any creative writing, fiction writing person will tell you, to do that, you have to constantly set up the world within which the story is. So a lot of the times, the point that I'm making in each of the chapters, I'm setting up the context around it. So there is an entry hook, like there's a chapter called Karlo Dunya Mutti Mein, which is fundamentally about the early 2000s. The book, in its essence, is a last 20-25 years discourse history of elites, if at all, if I can put it like that. So early 2000s, mid 2000s, that whole boom of MBAs, B schools were going to save our country, and that narrative. So I start with that Karlo Dunya Mutti Mein, which is that Ambani ad thing. So it's a hook. Anybody who lived through the generation knows what we are talking about immediately. And then I'm going into the more minutiae of it. And somewhere in the chapter is also my analysis that part of the policy paralysis, part of the structural institutional erosions, part of the stasis that we see around us is rooted in the reproduction of some of these caste blind spots, which these institutions sort of formalized and normativized. So that's a little bit about the kind of mix of methodological traditions that I've kind of borrowed from, and writing as a discursive style. Like one of the chapters, for instance, which where I'm talking about intimacy and sexual relations, like I borrowed like Fanon's framework there, and he's writing in the context of race, and like I flip it and try to like write it in the context of caste. And while writing, I'm telling itself that like classical Fanonians will probably be very upset with this kind of a framework, because he's looking at it from a very different epistemic tradition, and I'm looking at it from a, but like it's also sort of like a little bit of a homage, but also a little bit of taking it and borrowing it. So there is a lot of that fluidity in the methodology and the writing style that I've tried to incorporate.
You make an interesting point about research methods. Well, it's not an isolated observation. I have also seen many students come to me and say that they really don't know research methods until they have reached a PhD level, and now they're asked to write a research methods section. And a lot of it, I think, comes down to how they are not taught research methods, because the idea that guides it is that just go figure it out. And similar to, also academic writing, that no need to learn it, go figure it out. But the figuring out process is also not homogeneous, it's very stratified, and people with privileges figure it out, whereas the ones who are marginalized don't. So I tend to agree with that, but it's a separate discussion, and if I go into it, it'll just not be
Sure.
enough time. And I'll come back to about your book and ask you very simply to lay out, because you're also talking about taking academia to public and making it accessible to non-academic readers, to explain who a savarna is, and do you think savarna culture is homogeneous?
Um, so I've written this, like the first chapter of the book itself is called What is a Savarna? Because I am very aware of the fact that for a lot of caste, like what you call historically upper caste people, like the word Savarna itself, they will be like, what is this? Without knowing that it refers to them. Savarna, in its a very simplistic explanation, if I have to kind of break it down, the most simplest understanding of it is that Savarna, like in the caste system, the pyramid that you get in most NCRT textbooks or wherever, there'll be an introduction of a caste system as a pyramid with layers, Brahmins and Kshatriyas and Banyas and then Shudras. So each of those is a Varna. Varna is like a category, which has many jatis under it. So the top three Varnas of that are Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas. And they are allowed, like Brahmins, of course, are allowed historically the access to the thread, the sacred thread. Brahmin men are allowed that because that's considered like whatever religious and Kshatriya men and Vaishya men, under certain circumstances, can also, like, in certain traditions, are also considered worthy, although there are restrictions built into it. Shudras cannot have it. And below the Shudras, or beyond the Shudras, I shouldn't say below, beyond the Shudras, are the Avarnas, people without a Varna. So the traditional pyramid doesn't include them, which are historically people who are considered outside the Varna pyramid. In the modern context of the term, constitutional term would be scheduled castes, or people who are inside tribal areas so remote that they are outside the Varna society only. So they are considered avarnas. So the avarna people cannot have access to these things. Even Shudras, although they are part of Varna society, so technically they are also savarna, but in everyday parlance, the top three, which who have access to some of these and have access to some divinity or not divinity, like these social rituals and stuff, they are considered, although it's graded, they're called Dwij Savarna, like they're born twice. The Shudras cannot be Dwij. So in the book, what I've tried to talk, whenever I'm talking about using the word Savarna, it mostly means Dwij Savarna, right? But there is also like what we are calling Shudras, who are not Dwij, but Shudras in the modern constitutional terminology would be OBCs. Now, OBCs are a very wide range of terms, but there are about 45, 50 castes of OBC who also have a lot of post-colonial era, like a lot of political, social, cultural agency, where in a way they have also emerged as some kind of a dominant caste mobilization. So some of the things that I'm talking about also speak to these castes. So using the word only Savarna sort of lends that fluidity which speaks to them, also doesn't speak to them, which is also where their status is. So that's what effectively what how I'm calling it Savarna. Like, was that the question? Have I missed a part of it? Like, or if I have, let me know.
The follow-up to it was that do you understand Savarna culture as homogeneous?
Homogeneous. Yes, no, absolutely. I do not see it as homogeneous. And in fact, I will even make this point. I don't think I put it in the book in as many explicit terms. This is where theorizing on caste is so different than, let's say, theorizing on race relations in a society like US. Because race is on your skin, you can just see it, right? So, and you see a movie like Dhadak 2 has now come. Like I'm told I haven't seen it. I've only seen the trailers, but I'm told it's a very well-meaning, sincere film. But if you see just from the trailers only, it's very clear the actor, the male actor who plays the lead character, his skin has been darkened. Clearly, he's not that tone, which is very strange because I know fair-skinned scheduled caste people, fair-skinned Dalits, and I know dark-skinned Brahmins. It's not a racialized identity in that in that very classical sense. So, firstly, though, you can't really racialize caste as an identity. There are, of course, racial undertones to a lot of those things. The idealized feminine beauty types and the idealized associations of, who's pure and impure and with skin color. So there is racialization definitely, but it is not a racialized identity by itself. So that's one. Number two is it's also graded inequality. So even within the Dwij Savarnas, for instance, there are fissures, there are these fractures, which manifest in multiple ways. Politically also, like the easiest to explain is electoral terms, and I put this in, like, in the 2024 Lok Sabha election that just happened. There was this whole narrative about Brahmins versus Thakurs in UP. Kshatriya groups where, like, they were feeling that the BJP, which is their traditional party that they're voting for, is doing too much outreach to the OBCs because the BJP takes their own vote for granted. So, like, there is like all of those little frictions that are there. Calcutta, where I grew up, the city famously has like a very clear Marwadi versus they say Marwadi versus Bengali, but it is actually like the Bengali Savarna, Bhadralok, who have the cultural access to life. So they will be watching, Satyajit Ray, and they have a claim to a different kind of intellectual tradition. Whereas, the Marwadis in the city also have a very interesting claim because, Bada Bazaar and like all these Birlas and Haldirams, everything has come from that space. But they have very different like spheres. Their schools are separated. it's a bit of a friendly friction, but the friction is existing. So the Banya ecosystem, like, I'm very interested in looking at what is the Banya theory of the nation, and how does that differ from a Brahminical understanding of the nation. I'm sure it overlaps in multiple ways, but there are divergences to these things. And you can also see it in the way in which a lot of Brahmins, even right wing Brahmins, forget like liberal and left liberal, even like, who are in the Sangh or in the right wing part of it, how they respond to the over the top affluence display by Bania families like the Ambanis, right? So there is a little bit of that friction that is constantly there, which we miss, right? Like this is what I'm trying to point out, that there is granularity between these spaces, like Khatris who are Punjabis, like who are Punjabi trading communities. A lot of that culture overlaps with Marwadis and Gujarati Jains, but there are significant divergences also. So, what are those points of affinity? What defines? Where does it stop? Um, I think that would be very useful to study and read, and I don't think we tend to do. We have done that at all, or done that very little. So, yeah, definitely, I feel that there is variation. There is significant variation, and you'll get newspaper editorials, for instance, which will talk about upper OBC, lower OBC. Like there are PhDs actually where people will go into UP and do research on between scheduled castes, like Chamar versus Pasi conflict, or in Maharashtra Mahar versus Mang conflict, and Mala versus Madiga, and all of that. So that granularity people have looked at the scheduled caste, and and all of that, but we are not looking at that granularity is like what's happening between Kanyakuji Brahmin and Sarayupar Brahmin, and what's happening between Konkanastha Brahmins and Deshastha Brahmins. I don't think there is a PhD on this, like whether they are complementary, they have what are the variations, even anthropologically, under what conditions are marriages allowed, what special rituals are allowed, not allowed, what do you consider. I don't think these have been looked at, so that's one of the things. Yeah.
Right. The next question is from one of your chapters only, about how do Savarnas understand ideas of merit and achievement?
So this is an interesting question, because one of the, like, my theorization, one of the pathologies is that a lot of Savarnas, the way they see the world is so, they don't see it holistically. So even my book, one of the main frameworks that I've tried to make sense out of is something called a glass floor. What I'm saying is that assume that there's a family which lives in a house, and like any big joint family living, it's a huge house, so there's enough place, everybody has their own rooms and like whatever. But like they have feuds, they have conflicts. Some uncle is doing very rich, some other cousin is not doing so rich, so they will struggle. There is rise and fall, and there is struggle. But below the floor of the house live thousands of people who have no access, who have nothing, and whose ceiling is the glass floor upon which this family lives. So they can see everything above, but the family above is not looking at the people below the floor, right? So what tends to happen is, if one of the cousins, let's say, who's poor, works very hard and like ends up doing better than the uncle, he or she will be like, I'm a self-made man, or I'm a self-made person. But the fact is, you're living already in this house, you have your own room, you already have access to a lot of those things, you have leisure, you have whatever, XYZ things, many variables. You didn't start from below the floor, right? So their point of reference of their own journey, about the cost it took, their merit, self-madeness, completely overlooks the part, because their baseline is the glass floor. So what tends to happen is, they tend to frequently overestimate their merit because they don't have a fundamental um, analysis of how much privilege has also gone in. What are the advantages? Nowadays, in the last 5, 6 years, I've noticed, as an Ambedkarite scholars, a lot of Savarnas have started saying, they've started using the vocabulary. Okay, like, I'm acknowledging my privilege. No, don't say that. Operationalize that. I would rather you not say it, but operationalize what do you mean? How did that privilege help you? Right? It's not enough to say, look, I know I have a lot of privileges, I live in the city. Okay, operationalize that. What did it do for you? How many ways in which it created access to knowledge, it created even the idea, like, where did your ambition come from? What inspired you? Where did the thought come from? Right? When I was younger, I genuinely did not even know till college first year, although I grew up in a city like Calcutta, that law was a well-paying profession. I just did not know it because the only lawyers I had seen were typing out affidavits on the road. So just even that, like, shut out a possible entire career opportunity for me because I was like, oh, I can't do that. And there was nobody in my ecosystem around me to tell me that no, this is actually a profession that you'd be good at. You like researching, you make arguments quite well, you do debates and things like that. So even something minor like that can have such a huge effect on somebody's journey, right? When you're growing up around people, family members who are educated, who speak English, who are already accessible, like working in the service industry, or like, something like that, like, so that's what I feel. I think what it does is it creates a um, exaggerated sense of self credit. And then when you take that cohort of people and when you start putting them in charge of institution building, they tend to create institutions which are reproducing the exact blind spot. So as a result, these institutions are constantly saying that, oh, we are very innovative and we are building people for success, even though what's actually happening is you're building more and more privilege exclusionary kind of centers. So I think the idea of merit really needs to be looked at in a more critical sense. And I'll just say this in the end, like, the only time the word merit actually comes in this caste conversation is around reservations. And even in that, if you notice, the narrative is always framed like that, that, I worked hard, I got 99%, why should I give up the seat? Now, the only way you can get really worked up over that statement is unless you don't understand that apart from, yes, you worked hard, you studied 7 hours a day, nobody's taking that away from you, but you had a room, you had private tutoring, your parents had this, you had a bed to sleep on, you didn't have a job to do, your food was income precarious nahi the tum, if you're unwell people could take care of you, and the role those kind of things play, right? Unless you totally invisibilize that and you make your journey about I studied 7 hours a day, then of course you will get very outraged about, oh, I'm so meritorious, why am I giving it up? So I think that also the most obvious classical example of merit conversation also comes from exactly the pattern I'm talking about, where you're overestimating your journey and you're not understanding structures of privilege which have really aided this beyond your hard work. So yeah.
Right. The next is also a very loaded question, and it's something which can be an entire conversation around. But very briefly, if you have to use your own book to talk about it, what do you think is the relationship between caste, labor, and economy?
Caste, labor, and
Economy.
economy.
Yes.
I think this is one of the most rich areas of research, and I'm very sad that nobody is really looking at it in a very massive structural way. What I mean by that is, I have taught in a lot of business schools, right, including some of the IIM, like I was in IIM Kozhikode and all of that, where if you look at their curriculum, like a lot of the students, nobody's teaching them, like, the history of business finance in India. If you did that, you would immediately start understanding how some of these modern finance systems worked and how closely they were linked to caste. Like nobody's, I genuinely believe at the BBA or the MBA level, there should be a course or a module definitely on the opium trade in the 18 and 1900s. Because in many which ways, India, the British East India rule was like a drug empire, and like there was massive logistics involved, there was massive distribution and um, sales, and all of these things were involved. There were banya traders. There was export going on into China, and it destabilized the Chinese. It had massive global repercussions, and fundamentally at the core of it was a financial economic machine, which made the empire very profitable. So I don't think the business element of it is studied at all. And if we did, we would start seeing connections between the rise of Parsi capital in Bombay, for instance. We would start seeing the rise of Banya capital in Calcutta, right? And how these institutions sort of come out of these things. In fact, I think it was a Dalrymple book I was reading, where he's literally like saying that it is the Jagat Seths who are the main variable because of which the Battle of Plassey happens, which is the beginning of the British conquest of Bengal, which eventually unfolds. And so it is literally the trading caste, which is kind of trying to equate power balances. When the monarchies are like when they can't control the monarch and so on and so forth. So, what was the historical role of these trading castes, which built up really rich empires, but also could topple them when they didn't like it, and how has that role translated into a post-colonial setup where literally as we talk today, the Twitter buzz is and like Twitter buzz, is always very immediate and ephemeral. But I find it very interesting because today's Twitter buzz is a section of the right wing, mind you, is criticizing ORF. Okay, because they are saying this is an Ambani linked think tank, and these people are disrupting Indian foreign policy. Now, whether there is truth or to it or not is not the point, but it's very interesting because historically we have the idea that these trading castes were very close to the ruling hegemon, and you're banya, so you're not going to become the king, you're vaishya. There is a king, but you have a role, and that role is the economic sphere, but you're also exercising a power control balance. And how does that reproduce in contemporary society? And it's not, to me, it's not by accident that if you look at the contemporary India, India Inc., Indian corporation setup, who are you seeing here? It is Ambani, Adani, Bansal, Agarwal, Goenka. So you have the same groups reproducing in that sense, right? And despite 50, 70 years of Indian independence, you don't see. I think some people have started doing this kind of research where they're looking at the CEOs or the board of the board of the top 100 companies or top 500 companies, and they're coming out and saying, oh, like it is actually a very caste homogenous group in that sense. So I think these connections really need to be studied very well, because they have very real world policy impact, and social and cultural impact on our lives. I think some people are also looking at the connection, let's say, just to put you out there, a little controversial. For instance, cow lynching, beef lynchings are happening in North India, right? Now, there is a larger agrarian economy. 40, 50 years ago, Indian government pushed the white revolution for milk and dairy, independence. If you are going to create a mass cooperative dairy industry, and which is built around farming and animal rearing, you're going to have a lot of non-milk animal, which means it goes into meat processing in some way, shape, form, 1 or 2 or 3 degrees removed. And a lot of that work is carried out by historically, lowered Muslim castes. And if you criminalize that, that industry doesn't disappear. It just becomes corporatized, and a lot of the meat packaging industries are now owned by, more trading castes. So, like, it's almost like if you read this entire phenomenon beyond the politics, it's almost like a corporate banyaizing of different sectors of economy. We saw the same attempt play out with the farm laws. So there is a entirely different lens of reading the everyday news and horror that we are reading, which is coming out from these caste politics, just like reproducing themselves. So I think there's a lot to unpack, and like you said, it can be a completely different conversation by itself. But I think it is a very rich area of study to look at privileged caste and labor economy, not from the point of view of the marginalized, what's happening to the sanitation worker, what's happening to the coal mine worker, आंगनवाड़ी वर्कर, वो रिसर्च है, domestic worker, वो रिसर्च हो रहा है, right? And it is important research that should also happen, but I'm saying this lens should also be there.
Right. Yeah. Uh, of course, I also want to ask you about the relationship between the Savarnas and educational institutions. You touched upon it a little bit at the beginning when you were talking about social sciences, but could you also like elaborate on that?
So I'm very actually I haven't really covered this a lot in the book, but like I'm very fascinated by how some of these institutions were built. I'm not talking about the British era institutions, right? So I'm very interested in how the IITs were built, how the IIMs were built. What was the discussion? Who were the founding faculty cohorts? Who were the first two or three or four like the founding director and the next directors, right? How were they chosen? What were they talking about? And once you start looking closely at things like that, it starts becoming very clear that these were not through some kind of a very participatory consultative process. This was not like, let's pick the best and the brightest of our society. It's more like who's closer to the circles of power and policy, and who has more sway and how are they getting in, right? And institutions got built around that, and in many which ways I feel that because of that they've reproduced a lot of these tendencies. So even today in our most elite institutions, despite all the great research that comes out of it, like who's your guide, who's this, who's that, becomes as much an important question as what is your research. And the entire feudal culture within some of our universities, there's a lot being written about it, but nobody's looking at it from a caste point of view. What I'm trying to also say is that even the pedagogy and, like, apart from, so one axis of this is how these institutions were built. Like in India, like, now you go again on social media, some of these people will say, oh, what a vision we had, we built IITs and everything. So nobody's asking the question, but why did you? You're a poor post-colonial state. Your literacy rates were really, really low. I get the whole audacity of a dream argument, but did you really need to spend hundreds of crores that we didn't have at that point of time? Instead of like a mass decentralized literacy program, could we have looked at that? Could we at any point in the last 7 decades looked at that, including the current NEP, if you notice, which is completely, looking beyond the idea of English as a language paradigm of empowerment. So it feels like how these knowledges and institutions get produced by themselves is itself a question mark. Inside these institutions, how pedagogy is reproduced, how knowledge is reproduced is also another bit of a question mark, because most Indian universities will proudly say that we follow Guru Shishya Parampara. Guru Shishya Parampara is whose parampara, bhai? First of all, right? Who are the people? Which which section of the Varna pyramid was allowed in a Gurukul, and who was the guru coming from, right? And if you notice the teaching style of the Guru Shishya Parampara, if you could get a guru from like one of these epics, we start noticing a very interesting thing. The guru is never wrong because the guru is all knowing, right? So in a very Freudian sense, or whatever, like, that's not a guru, because guru can't learn from the students. Guru is not not a facilitator. Guru is all knowing. Guru can never be wrong. Even when the guru is wrong, it's right only because it's a test, right? And their primary teaching method is through test, pariksha. They will keep putting you in difficult situations, and if you are worthy, you will pass. So effectively, they are outsourcing the learning part to the student. Now, if you notice how things are playing out in a lot of institutions, many of our weakest students who are coming from marginalized backgrounds, are not coming from intergenerationally literate families, have against all odds defeated the Zilla Parishad, then the village panchayat school system, and still managed to come into the university. This sort of a training actually punishes them. This sort of training actually gives them weakness, gives them anxiety, gives them stress. So many will drop out. In the worst cases, student suicide rates unbelievable in this country. IIT Madras can be number one in our NIRF rankings, and in the same year also be number one in IITs and student suicides also. And the two are not seen as, this can't be it. It can't be our number one college if suicides happened on the campus, because you're seeing we're separate, because somewhere there's a mentality you're too weak and you couldn't cut it. So that mentality is itself coming from, it's not an IIT problem. It itself is a caste problem, right? So caste in the campus is not just ke I will call you, oh, you're from SC, I will call you names. वो भी होता है, I'm not saying that, but it is a very DNA of how we built this system, right? And how zealously it is guarded. Academia is still probably, it's easier to get into Google in the IT industry than to get into JNU, than to get into a top IIT for a marginalized caste researcher carving out an independent path. You can't get in. So it's still very, very guarded, despite constitutional safeguards, despite reservation mandates. None of these institutions are hiring. So one has to ask beyond the point, like beyond innocence, like why are you not doing this, right? And even historically, like I started by saying, historically how these institutions were built. Till 2005-6, they were not building IITs only. They used to, like when I was young, there were only 3-4 IITs and 3-4 IIMs, and their argument used to be, no, if we build more, IIT brand value will go down. Arey, but these are your citizens. Why do you not want more of your citizens to have the IIT experience if you build such a great IIT? Now we are building IITs in other countries, in Zanzibar and in Abu Dhabi and somewhere in the Middle East. So build more here, no. Build 5 more IITs, build 7 more IITs. वो आप नहीं करना चाहते, because somewhere if you democratize this education, then you're letting everybody in, which is against the very ethos, how these things are built. So even very well-meaning people will unintentionally, because they're so trained in this and they are not looking at their own caste reproduction, will end up reproducing these same things.
Right. I mean, if one looks at numbers, definitely, there has been some entry of marginalized groups into some of these spaces. And it's a very similar kind of argument with gender also, that, in some ways women have been able to enter. So, do you think this entry of people from marginalized groups into some of these very heavily savarna-dominated spaces have had any impact?
I don't want to sound depressing, but not really, because we are also now entering an era where we are seeing the limits of representational politics. We went through a period where representation was very important, and that was the first fight. But Rahul Sonpimple, who was like a Ambedkarite scholar and now a grassroots leader, he says this line which I like really a lot. He said that you guys were going on social media. I'm paraphrasing. You guys are going on social media and saying there's no Dalit judge in Supreme Court. There's no Dalit judge in Supreme Court. Now they put Dalit judge and he's giving you anti-Dalit judgment. Now what will you do, right? So in many which ways, it points out to the limitation, like for the women who get into it, like women especially from marginalized castes who are getting in, like in many which ways you're not bigger than the system. The system has not bucked or moved. System has just tried to co-opt you in many which ways, and the system is too powerful to immediately break you. So when you go into, I've noticed this actually, even like marginalized caste scholars will go into these institutions in many which ways start talking and mimicking and reproducing exactly the kind of savarna scholarship that they should be critiquing, because that is the normative definition of a legitimate academic, right? I struggle with it in my everyday academic experience. I'm an associate professor and an associate dean, so it is a bit of a leadership position, and I have a team of about like 25-30 faculty who work for me. So some of them, like, genuinely struggle with the idea that, like, why are you so accessible? Like, you shouldn't be accessible, you shouldn't be laughing with us, you should be in that office. Like, when I do a conference, I should put you as like this headline, or like, you should come, we'll introduce you, and then you will come, because that's the reproduction of academia that they have seen. And it's very, very difficult for them that we'll do a conference, we want to do like a lamp lighting ceremony and all. I was like, we don't need it. Like, we are here, let's talk, just give me the mic, I'll roll up my sleeves and I'll start talking. To them that feels, oh, you're not legitimate, because you're not following this is not how it is done, because they've so deeply internalized how academia is done from that framework. So which is why I find, the frameworks of Fanon and, to an extent, even like, Malcolm X, like the way they're talking about, like, it is a mind only which has been very deeply sort of colonized, and in our case very sovereignized. And academia definitely is one of those spaces where we are still yet to develop a very independent vocabulary of, how we should be doing anti-caste academia. So it's a work in progress.
Right. Uh, just to end with a very, loaded question again. How does one see the future of India in this context?
Okay, so again, I am not a like, I am known to be very morose and, like, upset people. I'm actually, I really want to be wrong, but I am not very. I don't see good signs, and especially the last week or so is has been personally terrifying for me, because people who've been in my classes or my colleagues, I've been saying this for almost 2 years now, that I see this eventually, I don't even want to say it, but eventually going down a military takeover. Because India is the only South Asian country, if you notice, which has not had like military rule. Because our civilian institutions were built very strong, and like there was a, unlike some of these other examples in Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, wherever, um, our grassroots mobilization and grassroots democracy, despite all its problems, somehow there was a structural faith in the system. But eventually the system gets bucked and skewed so much, so the contradictions can't keep up with it, and you will take more and more liberties, till eventually, once these start collapsing, then it becomes very, very difficult to maintain the social fabric. And I think one of the things which has happened is, I think we will look back on this era from about 2002, 2001 to about 2020, 21, 22, till COVID. ये जो 20 साल का जो era था, we are now over the hill. In that 20 years, this will be seen as a missed opportunity generation. Like, there was a genuine window of opportunity where the global economics lined up with us. We had a demographic advantage, capital was starting to accrue. Our cities were not the current unlivable mess that they are. They were still kind of building themselves up. We had a window of opportunity, and it was totally, totally squandered, because the people who got the steering wheel were totally, like, not up to the task, because their training doesn't allow them to see, all the structural blind spots is. They ended up creating, like, these small enclaves for themselves, because that's how they see fundamentally, it reproduces. So gated communities, international curriculum schools for children, some boutique cafes, some boutique things here and there. Vacation, earlier people used to go to Goa, now so many people go to Goa, so now they go to Sri Lanka or wherever, Vietnam, right? eventually this can't hold, so they all will leave. So the last chapter of my book is the Great Savarna Exodus. None of the elite Savarnas who've like the last 3 4 generations, paradoxically, they've built the country. If you go into their families, many of these people, they'll say, my grandfather was a freedom fighter, my great grandfather freedom fighter, my grandfather was whatever judge or something, my father was IT professional, and now they are studying in Sonipat Liberal Arts College and they want to go abroad. Nobody wants to come back. So that's not the story here, right? So in many which ways the elites are migrating and they're leaving behind a contradiction and failing institutions which have been thoroughly corroded, and all of that is a very predictable recipe for some kind of some kind of a martial formation rule, whatever shape it takes, or even worse, like outright chaos and anarchy. So it terrifies me, but it almost feels like we are backsliding in that direction. And every 6 months something will happen which I was like, oh, we are already here. I thought this moment was going to be a few years down the line, but we're already here. So that's how I see the future playing out. I hope I'm very, very wrong. I'll be very happy with that.
Yeah, I mean, I really hope you're wrong as well, considering that I still like to believe I'm an optimist at some, level. But thank you so much for that conversation, and I am requesting all our viewers to read the book, engage with more scholarship on caste, particularly from an upper caste perspective. And thank you once again to our speaker for taking the time out.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. Take care. Have a nice day.